nobody really just gets up and starts browsing Apple Podcasts or Spotify. People are being driven by something. We have to figure out what is bringing people to the table here. And then once we've identified that, emphasize and re-emphasize that in everything. The branding, the title, the episode titles, the description.
There's this little bit of a gap between okay, the show sounds interesting, but I don't understand where do I fit into that as a listener and who fits into that as a listener.
If you want to grow, you have to be able to connect with real human beings, and they want to know what's in it for me.
Welcome back to another podcast roast where in every episode we dissect one of our listeners' show's packaging, and so their title, cover art, show description, episode titles, and more to help them improve their show's discoverability and new listener acquisition and help you do the same along the way. And in today's episode on the skewer, we have Global Health Pursuit by Hetal Baman. And Justin, without any further ado, I'm going to toss it over to you to hear your first impressions based on the initial packaging that you see here in Apple Podcasts.
Yeah, I just pulled it up. Global Health Pursuit. The title makes me think, of course, of healthcare. It makes me feel like we're going to be talking about, issues around the world. The cover art itself, actually, if you just told me Global Health Pursuit, that is so general. Is that we're all doing a running program together? Are we all doing a fitness challenge together, a nutrition challenge together? I have no idea, but once I see the cover art, my view of the show changes a little bit. It's like these line drawings and kind of gives me there's a plane there. It almost gives me nonprofit vibes. This is going to be from a public health perspective.
Yeah, I think when I first heard the name Global Health Pursuit, and so for context here, when somebody submits their show, we see the show name written out in an Apple Podcast review. And so we have no cover art to go on. And so I saw this and I thought Global Health Pursuit, my actually first thought was more in line with the nonprofit NGO, maybe even the UN has something related to global health. And so I hadn't actually thought that maybe there was a challenge that this could be somebody who's a person who teaches fitness and that they're running this kind of thing. And so that actually there are two, potential ways that you might take this. But once I see the cover art, this really quickly clues me in to more of what the show is. We don't quite know yet, but I am a huge fan of this cover art. So this line drawn plane near the top, we've got those bunch of different kind of hand drawn little sketches of a kind of doctor's bag, tap with some water, plant, hands holding some books, and some a baby bottle and pacifier, and then a needle, and then a stethoscope. And so we got these elements here. The plane jumps out at me. It's front and center at the top. I think it's also the biggest one. And even the color of this cover art, this kind of olive pale green, it really draws me in. And the text is so clear. Yeah, I really like this cover art. It feels really professional. It makes me think that this is going to be really good quality production. It feels very intentional. So far, based on the title and the cover art, I have a very high positive first impression of the show.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. Let's move on to the description here. Why are infants dying for preventable reasons? Is it really safe to 3D print organs and medical devices? Is poverty porn still a thing? What is voluntourism, and is it really bad? What does storytelling have to do with taking a vaccine? The realm of global health is vast. Okay, so I'm just going to stop there so we can maybe comment on that first section.
Yeah, so I really like this way of starting out a show description, and I do a lot of audits. Every week I do probably 2 to 3 really deep dive audits of client shows that take many hours that I spend with the show. And in the past year, I've probably done 50 or 60, something like this. And one of the things that keeps coming up is descriptions. And this is one of these archetypes that I keep coming back to time and time again, is this starting with a big question that your show is going to unravel. And so not every show is designed to explore a question. I think some are more teaching, where it's you as the host have the answers and you're going to bestow your knowledge on the audience. And so that's one way to do it. And I think a lot of times for shows like that, the other archetype that I often go to is calling out the big problem facing your people. And so with our show, Podcast Marketing Trends Explained, I use that description archetype where it was it's never been easier to start a podcast, but it's never been harder to grow one. And so here's kind of calling this thing out that the audience already knows to be true, even though everybody's telling them it's so easy to start a podcast. And then we're kind of saying, hey, you started a podcast, you got that done, but you're struggling to grow it, and it's not just you. And so we get, where you're coming from, and this show is going to solve that. And so that's the one thing that I often go to. But this one, I really like, where it's like, here's some questions that the show is not purporting to already know the answers to, but you're going to go on a journey with the host to try and uncover these questions and get to the bottom of them, which is, I presume, where we're going to go with this show.
And as we continue down here, there's this idea of what does it take to be a humanitarian? Where do we donate our time and money to create the biggest impact? And you can imagine that if there's a listener who is struggling with these questions and looking for answers, reading this description would say, "Oh, I'm in the right place."
Yeah.
That would be their reaction. I also like that Hetal has this description hosted by engineer turned social impact storyteller.
Yeah.
Just saying I'm an engineer, so I have, some rigorous academic
Yes.
bona fides here, but I'm also a social impact storyteller. There's something about that I think works in terms of social proof and letting us know that this person may have what it takes to delve into these topics.
Yeah. The one thing I would say is there are a lot of questions here, and I
Mm,
might break that up. And so it's not so many questions where it starts to feel a little bit overwhelming. I always revert to three. So there's this idea of the rule of three, which is prevalent in all kinds of storytelling. And it's kind of a rhetorical device where three just feels good. And there's all kinds of like science
mhm,
behind this. It's really fascinating once you start actually listening to this. And a lot of jokes follow the rule of three as well. And one of the things that people will say, like why this potentially works, is that three is the smallest number that you can set up a pattern and then break it. And so a joke, you can have
mm,
like somebody does this, and you're expecting it to go the same way the third time. And then the punchline is when they do something else, or there's a break in the pattern. And so that's kind
yeah,
of one way that the rule of three can play out, but it also plays out just in lists of having like this, and that. And it just feels like a nice tidy package. And so this is a like
mhm,
little copywriting little hack that I just basically use three for everything now. And it feels like it flows nicely. There's some musicality to it almost. And so I might open with three questions and then introduce like the world of global health is vast. And then I might say, on this podcast, we talk about this, and this. That we also explore topics
mm.
like this, and that. And so you can break it up into little bits of three that I think would actually give this some more momentum moving through it. But I think all the content here is wonderful. And I think, like you, that engineering plus social impact storyteller, that's this great kind of like, oh, there's an intriguing host behind this who is going to bring the kind of best of two worlds to the show. So I really like what she has
Yeah.
got here in the description.
If I was going to test out which questions I should put in this description, I would do a little survey for my audience. If I have people on Twitter or LinkedIn or I have a mailing list, I would send them a little survey and say, which of these questions is most interesting or are you most curious about
Mm.
or is most compelling? And I've done this over and over again with my own podcast, just sending people surveys, posting little polls on Twitter. And it's really worked in terms of identifying if I'm only going to choose three questions to lead off this description with, which ones should I choose? And it just makes everything punchier, makes it more likely you're going to attract the kind of audience that's a good fit for this show.
Now, there is one last thing that I want to point out here with this description, and that is she talks about at the end here, real questions about real world issues without the fluff. So
Mhm.
this is something that a lot of people put in their description or they put it in their show title. They build their whole brand around it. And you can say without the fluff, but I think the audience gets to decide what fluff is. And, I think you
Mm.
and I, with our show, Podcast Marketing Trends Explained, I think we thought from our perspective that there's not much fluff in that show. Like we would cut 45 minutes from an episode and we still, when we asked for
Yeah.
listener feedback, people would say there's too much fluff or, I would want a more concise version. And so I think that this is something where it's really this instance of show don't tell, where I don't think she even
Mhm.
needs this. I think everything based on her title, cover art, and this description already tells me that there's not going to be fluff. And so I would just leave that out. And I think it feels stronger. And I would say to anybody, the analogy that I always come back to with this type of thing of like no fluff or no bullshit or things like that, it's the same as somebody telling you like, oh, I'm really funny. It's like, if you're really funny, you shouldn't need to
Mhm.
tell people. They will just get that from listening to you and being around you. And I think it's the same with this of like, that's not a promise that people trust because you can't actually make that promise. It's up for them to decide, is this fluffy or not?
Yeah, I like that. The other thing, I just had this other thought, which is while I think identifying questions that are going to be covered in the podcast. Like, if you're curious about this, we're going to talk about these kinds of issues. One thing that I'm still not sure about is what is the main job to be done
Hmm.
that people are coming to the show to have solved?
Yep.
What is the main motivation? What is driving people to a show like this?
Yeah.
What is drawing them to a show like this? And I would do a listener survey on that as well. I would find out of your best listeners, what is their primary motivation for listening to the show? And the way to discover this is to ask people, how did you discover the show? What were you searching for? What kinds of things were going on in your life at the time? What were some of the things you might have been struggling with or looking for? And try to pull out this narrative. Like, what's the main thing that's motivating people to come and consume this content? And so, for example, if the main thing is there's people who are trying to figure out where to donate their time and money to create the biggest impact,
Hmm.
if that's the main job to be done, I would really highlight that in everything.
Yep.
If it's people who are looking to travel around the world and while they're traveling, create impact, is that the primary motivation? People who are interested in volunteerism? You definitely get a sense of what the show is about, but I really like shows where there's a primary job to be done that you're doing for the listener. And that's still not quite clear for me.
Yeah, that's a good call out there. And if you read between the lines, it might be implied to some extent, but this idea of who is this for?
Mm,
And it might be a very different show if this is a show intended for people who are working in government and policy versus maybe NGOs. Maybe there's some overlap there versus the average person. And what is drawing the average person into the show? And I think the content is all going to be different and the presentation depending on who it is. And so being clear on that as the creator can help you both create, I don't want to say better content, but more aligned content with the job to be done and the person who's ultimately listening to it, as well as like finding places to find those people and market to them.
yeah. And maybe actually, as we move into the next section here, let's you and I adopt a persona. So let's imagine that you and I have just graduated from high school and we have a gap year and we want to use that gap year to make a difference in the world. And let's define this even more. Let's say that you and I are taking a gap year, but we're going to go into healthcare. That's the setting. With that in mind, what are you thinking as you scroll through these episode titles?
Yeah, okay. I love this setup here. So the first thing that I see is the first episode is a letter to my listeners season finale. So my first impression is, okay, that's for people who are already in the know. I'm going to skip right past that. The next one is reflecting on 1 year of global health pursuit. I'm actually going to skip past that one as well as a first time listener. I probably want to look for something that is going to just speak to me and call out to me. So next episode, I see from apathy to action, a journey to clean water. So, okay, here's something where I'm like, clean water. That's something that I might be able to latch on to here. I'm going to probably scan through a few more of these. And we see the next one is a rewind. So I'm assuming this is re-airing something. So global nutrition, addressing hidden hunger and stunting. Continuing to scroll down here, we've got the cave, a secret underground hospital. Okay, so that's starting to jump out at me here. A secret underground hospital. That sounds like
Mm-hmm.
there's some like intrigue. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the first one that really grabs me. And I think part of the reason why is it feels like there's a story there. And I
Yeah.
think she mentioned in the description that she's a storyteller. And so this is the first one where I'm like, ooh, I wonder, a secret underground hospital. That's something interesting and novel that I've never come across before. So I think that's the one that I would probably first click into. What about yourself?
Yeah, I love this idea of adopting a persona because instantly it put me in the mindset of like, okay, what if I was a 18-year-old listener, what would I be doing? I had the same inclination. I would probably skip these first two, and then we had okay, journey to clean water, okay, global nutrition. We're starting to get into healthcare, underground hospital. It was like, okay, that's definitely one, and then redefining ethical healthcare was actually the one that really jumped out at me.
Hmm.
And I think this is interesting because it shows why really understanding the job to be done and who the show is for, because a first time listener is very likely going to go through that same process. They're going to
Mhm.
be thinking, okay, is this show for me? And they're going to do a little scroll test and they're just looking for two or three episode titles that really speak to them.
Yeah.
let's do a little listen test at this point because I think we should follow this all the way through. So why don't we both click play on The Cave, episode 51.
War, bombings, terror. Is history repeating itself? We see it happening all around the world. And today's episode is about resilience in the face of war. The activists that are born out of war and the stories we must share to try our best to prevent it from happening again and again. For today's episode, I was humbled and honored to have a chance to speak with Dr. Amani Balor, a distinguished Syrian pediatrician, activist, and the author of The Cave, a secret underground hospital and one woman's story of survival in Syria. This is the story of a young woman who wanted a chance at education in a society that didn't value a woman's contributions. And time again, she proved everyone wrong by pursuing a career in medicine. And at the very same time, a war was breaking loose in Syria under the Assad regime.
I have a few thoughts.
Okay.
So, I mean, the main thought is I really wish there was more show, not tell here. You know, the first minute is this description that you see here. War, bombings, terror. Is history repeating itself?
Yep.
She's got a great voice, and there's some music under the intro. Felt very friendly, felt approachable, soft, kind-hearted. So I felt all those things, but I would have opened with the best clip from the guest, Dr. Amani Balur, I think she said. I would have opened with the best clip from that to really tease and pull the listener in right away. I've done this as well with interviews is, you know, you do the interview, but then in editing, you come back and you do the intro. And while you're recording the intro, there's this inclination to say, oh, I should just summarize a little bit about what they can get. Where I think what we should be doing more often is grabbing some really great clips that will add some intrigue, that will pull the listener in, that may introduce some unanswered questions and put that right at the beginning. So bam, you get right into the episode and it's this compelling clip that makes you want to keep listening to find out what happens.
So I will offer some pushback on that to some extent. I think a lot of times people pull clips to the start of the episode because that's what podcasts do. And there's no thought as to which clip am I pulling and why am I pulling this clip? And also, obviously, when you've been editing, you have all the context. You've already done the interview. You're then doing the editing, or maybe your editor is doing the editing, but they have the context too. And so the clip might not make sense to anybody who is just coming in. They know nothing about the episode and maybe even nothing about the show. And so I have listened to countless shows where I actually recommend you should not be really doing clips at the start because you can probably set up and tee up the episode better as the host rather than having to you've locked yourself into this format where, okay, my show's format, it starts with a clip. But a lot of times the guest, they haven't given anything succinct that actually hints at what the episode is going to be about. And so I think that's where it becomes problematic, where there may be something where the guest gave this like 3-minute long thing that was great, but you can't distill it down to 30 seconds and you don't want to put the full 3 minutes up front. And so I think usually when clips are done well, I think it's pulling from different parts of the interview to kind of actually make this little montage of things that you're going to be talking about. And this is actually something that, why not? We're going to shout out Jay Klaus again. We're going to make it like a perfect every single episode almost. I heard him talking about this recently, his process that he's developed with his editor, and they kind of just stumbled into this, but they tend to think about episodes as a kind of 3-act structure to some extent. And it's not that it always follows that perfectly, but what he talked about is that now with their clips, they try and pull one clip from each of the 3 acts and stitch together this mini narrative that hints at what's going to unfold over the course of the episode. And so I think this is where when you start to put a little bit more effort into the clips and think about, okay, my job here is actually to tell a tiny little story in 30 seconds or a minute. And so the clips have to play well together, and one has to open up some curiosity, and then you show, oh, and we're going to go over here, and then we're also going to go over here. And so the listener's like, whoa, how are we going to get from here to there to there? And part of this is like figuring out how the dots are going to connect. And also part of them is just getting excited of like, if these are three things that they're all interested in, and you also then have some context that's given by the title, that's when the clips start to work really well together. But that requires more editing. It requires a bit of skill in the storytelling department of finding these clips and pulling them together. And I know Jay's editor in that process, he was saying, as he's going through, he's flagging, 20 clips. And then he's pulling the ones that each are going to work well together, and not all of them do. It's like maybe the best clip from the episode doesn't actually work well with the other ones that you need. And so you pull something that's actually not as good a clip, but it makes a better overall intro when it's combined with these other ones. And so this is something that I think, like everything, there's this like way that everybody does it, and it works really well for some people, but often it's because there's a hidden layer beneath it that actually makes it more compelling. So I'm a fan of clips if you have a clear reason why you're doing it and which clips you're picking. But I think otherwise, usually what I'll do is I'll make a bullet point list and say, okay, well, how does this relate to my listener? And like, what is their current situation regarding this episode, the topic of this episode? What do they want? What is their desire? What's standing in their way? And, how does the episode solve that? And you can kind of just do a little bit of a run through of that bullet point list, and you can actually come up with a pretty interesting narrative kind of intro where you're like, imagine you're in this situation, but what you really want to be doing is this. The problem is that this is standing in your way. Well, on today's episode, we're going to be talking with so-and-so who actually developed a way to help you get this without that. And all of a sudden, this is a very simple framework that it's like the listener's like, oh, I am in that situation. I do want that thing. I do have this problem. And oh, the episode is going to solve it for me.
Yeah, I like that. Even I think, she's got all these great questions in her description. And if her listener is the kind of person that really gets fired up by, just hearing a good question at the beginning of an episode, maybe that's a simple format. Often, like, I'm pulled into an episode if they've articulated a question I've always had kind of on my mind, but I haven't found a satisfying answer to that question yet. And I think teeing up just like, what is the main question that you're trying to answer in this episode, and queuing that up at the beginning could also just be a really simple way to start the episode.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind here with this show in particular is it depends on who the audience is again, but I think that there may be a challenge of connecting with the subject of the episode. And so in this case, we've learned from this first minute that the book is about one woman in Syria who's faced a lot of hardship and a lot of obstacles to overcome and has had a lot of resilience. I think that we need to find a way to connect her experience to us as the listener. And so I think that that's, again, where the host can actually build out a scene and say, imagine this happens to you. You're in this situation and this happens. What do you do? Do you take this option? Do you take this option? How do you decide what the right choice is? And so here, now we're in the shoes of the person, and that's the story we're focusing on today, where now we have this connection because we've just been led through this like, oh, this is how I would think about that, and now I'm engaged.
Okay, so let's go back to our premise, which is we're 18 years old, we're doing a gap year, we want to go overseas and make a difference. We're going to go into healthcare when we go to university. In that case, I think I would want to know mostly about her intense experiences managing an underground hospital during the Syrian conflict. Because my main question is, what's it going to be like if I go and volunteer in a war-torn area? How do you do healthcare in a war-torn area? That's kind of the burning question in my mind. And if I'm pursuing which episode am I going to listen to first, and I'm trying to get to that, like, really, I'm just trying to figure out what's it going to be like when I go there. This guest and this book may cover all sorts of topics, but for a particular listener, and maybe for your ideal listener, you really want to pull them into that part that's most important to them, that's most pressing for them.
The other thing that comes to mind looking at both the cover art and the kind of description, I'm getting the vibe that there's the potential for this kind of crossover health podcast with travel podcast. And to me, that's almost like a really intriguing hook. And if that was the case, it really shifts a little bit of the framing for each episode where, especially if, let's just say, we don't know who her ideal listeners are, but let's just say that
Yeah.
we're our 18-year-olds and we're looking to go off and have an adventure. It actually feels like part of the show then needs to be building the scene and talking about this place that the average listener has no idea of and fleshing out
Mhm.
some of the details of the space and talking about, what of and fleshing out if I'm in Syria, what does the cave look like? Part of the reason that they want to do this is to go contribute something, but a big part of it is also like they want to go have an adventure for themselves. There is this
Yeah.
selfish bit of it as well. And so I think if that was the case, if that is part of the crossover here, this mashup of different kinds of concepts, I would really think about like, okay, what are the conventions from a travel podcast that I'm not just going to say the top 5 like places to go, coffee shops and, wherever, but we're bringing in some of the storytelling in maybe more of a National Geographic style that is more maybe humanitarian in nature, but has this sense of like building out the place because that that's something that's intriguing to people. And I think that, travel and adventure, this is something that a lot of people, if not most people, there is this innate pull to like discover kind of the unknown. And so I think that's something that could be played into potentially in more depth in this show.
Yeah. What I love about what you just painted is, again, we're not exactly clear who the ideal listener is for the show, but you have a great one-liner. So if someone said, "What's this podcast about?" It's a travel podcast for people who are interested in humanitarian aid in the health sphere. It's like
Yeah.
that's the succinct hook, and I think that would make a great description that just immediately lets me know that I'm in the right place if I'm the kind of person. And that description fits the 18-year-old taking a gap year, but it could also fit the 60-year-old professor who is also interested in the topic. But you're really painting it succinctly. It's like a travel podcast, but for people who are interested in humanitarian aid. Something to think about there. And for everybody who's watching, it just really helps to be thinking in these terms because nobody really like just gets up and starts browsing Apple Podcasts or Spotify. There's no random selection. People are being driven by
Yeah.
something. We have to figure out what is bringing people to the table here, and then once we've identified that, really emphasize and re-emphasize that in everything. The branding, the title, the episode titles, the description, the structure of the show, the introduction of the show. It
Yeah.
has to be everywhere so people know, "Oh, I'm in the right place." Not just I'm in the right place. It's like, "Yes, I want to listen to this." That's what
Yep.
you want to ignite in people. It's like, "Yes, yes, I've been looking for something like this." That's the
Yeah.
reaction you want.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is you mentioned before some questions about seeking out what your listeners were searching for, what was happening in their life that got them to look for a show like this. And there are
Mhm.
certain shows where people are highly motivated by a problem that they want to solve that they will go out and search in Apple Podcasts or on Google to like a podcast on this topic. And then there are
Yeah.
other things that people don't know to search for. And a lot of entertainment shows, I mean, people are always looking for, new true crime show, new fiction show, whatever it is. But a lot of
Mhm.
times you will come across a show or somebody will just offhandedly say something about it, mention it, and something will attract you to it. You didn't go out and search for it, but something caught your eye. And so I think
Mhm.
that that's a complementary question that you can ask both of these. So some people may have searched out your show, but also one of the things that I like to ask is what attracted you to this show in the first place? Like if you can remember
Mhm.
back to when you came across it, like what got you to take a closer look? And as we're thinking about this show, the thing that, we mentioned the title, that didn't really pull me into the show. I was a little bit like, okay, maybe a little bit interesting. I was kind of thought like, this is going to be by the UN or something like that, some department that's probably going to be boring. This committee is putting it out there. And then when I clicked in,
Mhm.
I was like, oh, I saw the plane immediately. And I was like, oh, this is like a travel podcast. And kind of building on what I said before, one of the things to me that is a hook, and I think that is something that I personally, okay, here I'm taking over the show here for a second, but if this was my show and if I have the idea of what it is based on my 1 minute of listening and the description, one of the things that I would really lean into is talking about the culture and the place and the people who make it up, because I think that culture impacts everything. and
Mm-hmm.
landscape and environment, and all these things play a role in every aspect of our life. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that like all of us would be different people if we were born somewhere else, let alone a different city in whatever country you're listening from. Like you would probably be a different person in a different city, or if you grew up in the country versus a small town versus a big city versus anything else. And so I think that this show, the part of the service to the listeners could be as well talking about the cultural and geographic and like building the context for the actual thing we're talking about here, which is maybe a specific initiative or health issue in that space.
It would be interesting to brainstorm some other possible titles for the show that might get us closer. One title that jumps into my head that's not quite there because it's missing the healthcare piece, but Travel with a Purpose. Like,
Mm,
if that was the title of a show, I immediately get a sense of, well, this is a travel show, but with something extra. This is travel with a purpose. Okay, this is probably like going somewhere and trying to make a difference.
yeah,
Thinking about some of those positioning questions might be good for a show like this and might actually attract more audience that are
yeah.
searching for this.
Yeah, for me, I feel like the word pursuit, it feels so close to being like the exact right word. And for me, I'm like, there's something, because I was thinking like global health adventure it feels more in the travel side of things, but also feels like it might feel too self-serving and not focused on the impact side of things. And so I feel like,
Mhm.
that's not quite right. But something in there that I think clues me in that there's like a quest. I mean, pursuit also hints at a quest, but I don't know. I would probably just like play around with tons of words. I think that it's solid as is, but this is something where there's always tweaking around the edges to be done that could improve things potentially.
Yeah. Let's jump over to Spotify. Interesting, there's a mix of shorter episodes, Can
Yeah.
Education Solve Poverty, and longer episodes, 43 minutes. I kind of like that. I like that there's opportunities and entry points for listeners to get in and have a shorter episode. There's also a trailer episode. Let's listen to this and see if we can get a better sense of who this is for.
When I was just 14 years old, I witnessed real poverty for the first time ever. We were driving out of Mumbai and towards my family's home in Gujarat, India. I saw people living in scrappy tents with little access to food and clean water. That image stayed with me for years and led me to ask questions so I could simply understand the reasons why I was privileged and they were not. This podcast is a platform where I ask those questions to experts who have dedicated their lives to improving the livelihood of people all around the world. I'm asking questions like, what is PrEP? And how does it relate to HIV in the Black community? What does it mean to be an internally displaced person in a last mile community? And how does this relate to access to healthcare? Why are infants dying from easily preventable causes? The realm of global health is vast. The amount of challenges seems overwhelming. Where do we start? What does it take to be a humanitarian? Where do we donate our time and our money and our resources to create the biggest impact? My name is Hetal Baman. I'm an engineer turned social impact storyteller, and I'll be your host. Join me as I seek to answer tough questions about the world from a beginner's mindset. Real questions about real-world issues without the fluff. This is the Global Health Pursuit.
All right.
So, thoughts on the trailer?
I'm actually now I feel like even more that this show has still not identified its ideal listener, and who the show is for. The trailer emphasizes global issues quite a bit more. It felt a lot more general than some of these directions we were going, and felt a little too general to me to be compelling. She starts with that story from her childhood. I felt like that was quite strong. I was interested, I was engaged. But as we started going through, she asked some more, I covered questions like this and this. I didn't get a sense of like, what's the purpose here? What is this show accomplishing? And what is this show going to accomplish for me? It felt a little too ambiguous.
Yeah, I agree with that. As I was listening through it, I really liked the opening story that she told. I think
Hmm.
that sets it up It's not always necessary, I wouldn't say, but it is certainly a boost when the host clearly has a backstory that they're internally motivated to do the show and they feel like the right person to be doing it. And so I think that she certainly has that. And so I really like that as she opened it up with a nice story that kind of put me visually in the place, and it kind of uncovered some of the questions that are driving her. But what I feel didn't happen is it didn't connect to me as a listener, which anybody can create a show to scratch their own itch and can build a platform to be able to get to the bottom of these questions that you want to find out for yourself. And so
Hmm.
it sounds like this started as a personal project. I think, though, as you want to grow the platform, which only furthers the mission, it's important to get clear on what that mission is, both for you and the show and the larger platform, and also who are the stakeholders in that and what do they care about related to this, and then make sure that that is coming through really clearly in the messaging. So that was
Hmm.
kind of, it just felt like there was this little bit of a gap between like, okay, the show's here, it sounds interesting, but I don't understand where do I fit into that as a listener,
Mm.
and who fits into that as a listener.
That line right there. Where do I fit into this as a listener? This is a challenge all podcasters have. We need to be thinking about the concept of our show in these terms. How does the listener fit into this? What's in it for
Mhm.
them? What's driving them? What do they need to get out of this? What are they hoping to get out of this? And with a lot of creative endeavors, it's like, well, I want to answer these questions or I want to interview these people. Okay, well, that's fine. But if you want to grow, you have to be able to connect with real human beings and they want to know what's in it for me.
Yeah.
Like, what's my part in this? What's my role in this? How's this going
Yeah.
to make me better?
Now, I will say that she has 71 ratings in Apple Podcasts in the US store,
Yeah.
so that is great. And also in Spotify has, it looks like 19 ratings and a 5-star overall average. And so it looks like she is certainly doing something well. And that makes me think, like we've talked about with some other shows in the past, that you even begin to start tightening up even more of these things and being more specific about how this fits into somebody's life, being really clear with that off the front. I think that you're going to get even more people coming in.
As I'm browsing these reviews, I think often people who get reviews on Apple Podcasts were saying, hey, folks, can you leave a 5-star review? We want a 5-star review. And so, often I want to help out my friends. I know my listeners want to help me out. So they'll come and they'll leave a 5-star review. What's missing from that is what often we get is a lot of platitudes. And as I'm browsing this, I'm just like, man, what's unfortunate is I'm still not really getting a sense of what's the driving force in this show. She's got all these great reviews, but
Yeah.
what is this show about? And it sounds like a lot of people are coming for the host, and so
Yep.
maybe that's enough. I see her name pop up over and over again, and maybe that's enough. Like, maybe she's just got a crowd of people that just love showing up and hearing her perspective. But I'm just as I'm browsing this, what I'm hungry for as a podcast marketer is I'm hungry for a real honest understanding from listeners who listen often. Why are you showing up? Why are you coming back for this show? Like, what is for you here?
Yep.
And again, I'm kind of thinking about for myself and other podcasters, it's just reiterating how powerful a listener survey can be because I think what we're missing from these reviews, it's amazing. She's got so many reviews, but I would actually love to see more reviews like this one. Episode 6 was great. I want to learn more about Haiti. I might be going to represent Medical Bridges. I expect to be there in August, and I would like to hear their insight. Hetal, thank you for creating this podcast. So there I can see what's driving the person. And if I'm a
Yep.
potential listener, I can see that journey. It's like, oh, I don't want to go to Haiti, but I'm going to Syria in 2 months. Like, if this is the kind of person that listens to the show, then I'm in. And we often talk about Seth Godin's line, people like us do things like this. So
Yeah.
who are the people that are doing things like this that you're trying to attract? Amazing to get all these wonderful reviews, but this one here is the one that actually I think might help get more listeners.
I just finished reading a book called The Mom Test by, I'm guessing you probably know him, Rob Fitzpatrick.
Excellent book. Yes.
Yeah. And one of the things that he talks about, so essentially the premise of the book is how to solicit feedback that even your mom couldn't lie to you about. And so the setup here is that if you tell your mom about a business idea or a podcast, she'd be like, oh, I love that. That sounds amazing. That's going to be the best podcast ever. And she is, of course, lying to you. Or, if you want to think generously about it, she just has severely rose-colored glasses on about everything that you do. And so this is true for a lot of feedback that we get. And one of the things that he brings up is that people can sense a lot of times by the way we frame questions that our ego is on the line. And so they're people who do want to support us. And so they actually won't give us honest feedback because we have already signaled through the framing of the question in subtle ways, or our posture as we ask it to them face to face or on a Zoom call. They know this person does not actually want real feedback. And I was thinking about this week when we did an episode on Podcast Marketing Trends Explained about the listener feedback we got. And I have seen more feedback since then, but even throughout the season, of people who are being refreshingly honest with us. And one of the things that Rob talks about is that at some point, by soliciting feedback and taking it with grace and humility, you actually signal to people that you do want it and they can be honest with you. And I think that something has happened with us, that we've actually been really open about sharing some of the critical feedback and how we took it. And also saying like, oh, that one maybe stung a little bit, but they're right. They have a point and we should be doing that. I think when you can take that kind of feedback and demonstrate that to people, more people are more likely to actually give you good feedback because they do want to help you. They're actually on your side and they're willing to be able to say, okay, I know that Jeremy and Justin want feedback and I know that they can take it because they've done it in the past. And I know that they've acted on it. So they've proven that like, okay, they're going to solicit listener feedback and they're going to integrate that into what they're doing. And I know that they're going to be more successful because of that. And so there's a bit of a flywheel here where initially you need to like actually get through to people that like, we really do want this. We don't just want 5-star reviews. I mean, maybe we want the 5-star reviews, but we actually want some feedback that is useful within there on how we can improve. And as you start to get more of that and you prove that like, yeah, this is actually what we want. We're glad for it. Bring some of that criticism. Like you're going to get more of that, but it's actually a good thing. And you'll realize that usually people have good intentions behind that critical feedback.
Yeah. I'm going to pull out 2 takeaways from what you just said. 2 things that I thought of. One is I think you should still solicit 5-star reviews. I think, you want to have nice 5-star reviews. One great prompt for soliciting 5-star reviews is, hey folks, if this episode or any episode really resonated with you, I would love for you to leave a 5-star review and mention the episode, either the episode number or title, and then talk about why it was so meaningful for you. You're prompting the listener to give you the feedback that you're looking for, or give you the testimonial in this case that you're looking for. The second thing is you could follow that up and say, so you're pointing people who've had a good experience to the Apple Podcast reviews, and then you're telling them what kind of things you'd like them to talk about. Then you can point the people who are unhappy and say, and folks, if this episode was not great for you, I want to hear from you. We have a link in the show notes called Tell Us What's Wrong. Complain box or something. Yeah, and make it a bit. But if you did that, you not only are going to get better 5-star reviews, but you're also going to get incredible feedback that might lead to more 5-star reviews.
Yeah. The one thing that I'll just kind of close the loop on the Rob Fitzpatrick Mom Test book is one of the things that he talks about, this is, I think, the most important takeaway from the book, is do not ask people hypothetical questions. So would you listen to this podcast? Would you listen to an episode if I did this? Would you listen to it if it was longer, if it was shorter? And this is something that we touched on in our episode, breaking down some of the listener feedback we got, where what is more valuable is what people already do. So what their actions they are already taking. And so if you can see that people do listen to shows that are 60 minutes, but they're telling you that yours should be shorter, then it's like, okay, the length isn't the problem. It's that this show is not valuable enough to them. Or if you would listen, they say like, oh, I would totally listen to a podcast on global health. But are they actually listening to your show or any others like it? Then that's the indication that, okay, maybe there isn't as much appetite for this as I thought. And so just thinking about that, avoid hypotheticals, dig into what are they currently doing. And that might not mean that they're listening to a show that's exactly like yours, but look at like, do they listen to podcasts in general? How much time do they spend listening to podcasts? How do they find new podcasts? All of these questions that are based on their existing activity, these are the helpful indicators that you can kind of pull some useful data from and tap into.
All right, so I think that wraps it up for Global Health Pursuit. Thanks to Hetal for submitting the show. If folks want to submit their show for a podcast roast, they can do so by searching for our podcast, Podcast Marketing Trends Explained. leave a review on Apple Podcasts and just list the name of your show.